No one knew who the waitress really was, until the Admiral called out her name from the battlefield. The small diner on Highway 9 had seen better days. The vinyl seats were cracked, the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and the waitress who worked the morning shift moved with a quiet efficiency that impressed even the most demanding customers. Her name tag simply read, Sarah, and for 3 years, she had served breakfast to truckers, traveling salesmen, and locals who appreciated her no-nonsense approach to service. Sarah Martinez appeared to be in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing nothing. She arrived at the diner every morning at 5:30 sharp, tied her apron with military precision, and began preparing for the breakfast rush. The other staff members had long since stopped asking about her past. She was reliable, competent, and kept to herself. The customers who frequented Murphy's diner had their own theories about Sarah. Some thought she was running from a bad marriage. Others suspected she was hiding from debt collectors or perhaps saving money for college. A few of the older men who came in for coffee noticed something different about the way she carried herself, the way she scanned the room when new people entered, and how she never seemed startled by sudden noises that made others jump. What none of them knew was that Sarah Martinez had spent 8 years as a decorated Navy combat medic, serving 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. She had saved more lives than she cared to count, earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star, and left the military with wounds that weren't visible to the casual observer. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any battlefield she had ever faced. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Sarah was refilling coffee cups and taking orders from the usual crowd when she noticed an unusual number of military personnel stopping by the diner. Word had spread that Admiral James Richardson, a highly respected Navy commander, would be visiting the nearby military base. Local news crews had set up in the parking lot, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had become something of a legend in military circles. Admiral Richardson had built his reputation on never leaving a soldier behind and maintaining personal connections with the men and women who served under his command. Stories of his battlefield leadership were told and retold in military academies around the world. What made him truly unique was his ability to remember every person who had served in his units, their faces, their stories, and their sacrifices. As Sarah went about her morning routine, she could hear the excitement building outside. The local radio station was broadcasting live from the parking lot, interviewing people about their thoughts on the Admiral's visit. Inside the diner, conversation centered around military service and war stories. Several veterans who regularly frequented the establishment began sharing their experiences, creating an atmosphere thick with pride and remembrance. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she listened to the conversations swirling around her. She had worked hard to build a quiet life where her past remained buried. The simple routine of taking orders, pouring coffee, and making small talk with customers had become her therapy. The diner represented safety, normalcy, and distance from the memories that still haunted her dreams. But today felt different. Today, the past seemed to be pushing against the carefully constructed walls she had built around her new life. She tried to focus on her work, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, and she found herself checking the exits more frequently than usual. The turning point came when Admiral Richardson himself walked through the diner's front door. Sarah was behind the counter, her back turned as she prepared a fresh pot of coffee. The entire restaurant fell silent as the distinguished officer, still imposing despite being in his 60s, surveyed the room with the same careful attention he had once used to assess battlefields. He wore his dress uniform with obvious pride, ribbons and medals telling the story of a long and distinguished career. His presence commanded respect without demanding it, and even the most boisterous customers found themselves speaking in respectful whispers. The Admiral moved through the diner slowly, shaking hands with the veterans present and thanking them for their service. Sarah kept her head down, hoping to remain invisible until the visit was over. She had successfully avoided recognition for 3 years, and she wasn't about to let one unexpected encounter destroy the peaceful life she had worked so hard to build. But as she turned to face the dining room with the fresh coffee pot in her hands, her eyes met those of Admiral Richardson. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the two studied each other across the crowded diner. Sarah saw recognition dawning in the Admiral's eyes, followed by something that looked like disbelief. She watched as he processed what he was seeing, his military bearing giving way to genuine surprise and what appeared to be relief. The Admiral took a step forward, then another, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. The conversations around them continued, but Sarah felt as though she and the Admiral were alone in the room. She set down the coffee pot with hands that were no longer steady and waited for the moment that would change everything. Admiral Richardson had seen too much combat and lost too many good people to forget a face like Sarah's. He remembered the young medic who had saved his life during an ambush outside Kandahar. He remembered watching her work under impossible conditions, treating wounded soldiers while enemy fire rained down around them. He remembered recommending her for the Silver Star and wondering what had become of her after she left the service. The silence in the diner was becoming noticeable. Other customers began to sense that something significant was happening, though they couldn't understand what they were witnessing. The local news crew outside continued their broadcast, unaware that inside the humble diner, a story far more compelling than a routine military visit was about to unfold. Sarah found herself caught between the overwhelming urge to run and the deeply ingrained military discipline that had been drilled into her during years of service. She stood frozen, watching as one of the most respected leaders in the military approached her with recognition and something that looked remarkably like gratitude in his eyes. The moment stretched on, filled with the weight of shared experiences, unspoken memories, and the collision of two very different worlds. In that small diner on Highway 9, the past and present were about to collide in a way that would change Sarah's carefully constructed new life forever. The question was no longer whether her secret would be revealed, but how she would handle the revelation and what it would mean for the quiet existence she had fought so hard to create. As Admiral Richardson continued to approach, Sarah realized that her 3 years of anonymity were about to come to an end. The waitress who had successfully hidden her identity was about to be recognized by the one person who could expose not just who she was, but what she had done in service to her country. No one knew who the waitress really was, until the Admiral called out her name from the battlefield. Admiral Richardson stopped directly in front of the counter, his weathered face breaking into a smile that transformed his entire demeanor. The formal military bearing gave way to something much more personal as he looked at the woman who had once saved his life under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent diner. "I never thought I would see you again." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. After 3 years of careful anonymity, her military rank and surname hung in the air for everyone to hear. She felt the eyes of every customer turn toward her, saw the confusion and curiosity on familiar faces. The comfortable invisibility she had cultivated was shattered in an instant. "Admiral," she replied quietly, her training taking over even as her world tilted off its axis. Despite everything, she found herself standing straighter, unconsciously falling into the military bearing that had once been second nature. Admiral Richardson's smile widened as he extended his hand. "The last time I saw you, you were covered in dust and blood, working on Corpsman Jenkins under heavy fire. You saved his life that day. You saved all of our lives." The diner erupted in whispers as customers began to understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. The quiet waitress who had served them coffee and eggs for 3 years was being recognized as a war hero by one of the most decorated officers in the Navy. Sarah accepted the Admiral's handshake, feeling the calluses and strength that spoke of a lifetime of service. "Just doing my job, sir," she said, falling back on the response that had always felt safest. "Your job?" Admiral Richardson shook his head. "Sergeant, what you did that day went far beyond duty. When that IED exploded and we were pinned down, you didn't hesitate. You crawled 50 yards under enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. You performed emergency surgery with mortars falling around us. You coordinated the evacuation that got all of us out alive." The story unfolded in the hushed diner as Admiral Richardson continued to speak. Sarah could feel her carefully constructed walls crumbling as he described the battle that had earned her the Silver Star. She remembered every detail of that horrible day, the screams of wounded soldiers, the acrid smell of explosives, the weight of responsibility as she triaged casualties under the worst possible conditions. "I put you in for the Medal of Honor," Admiral Richardson said, his voice growing serious. "The committee felt the Silver Star was more appropriate, but I never agreed with that decision. What you did that day was nothing short of miraculous." Martha Wilson, who had been coming to the diner for 15 years, found herself staring at Sarah with new eyes. The woman who had quietly refilled her coffee every Tuesday and Thursday was a decorated war hero. Bob Stevens, a Vietnam veteran who sat at the counter most mornings, felt tears welling up as he realized he had been sharing breakfast with someone who understood the weight of combat in ways he had never imagined. Sarah felt exposed and vulnerable as Admiral Richardson continued to recount her service record. He spoke of other battles, other moments when her medical skills and courage had made the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. He mentioned her 2 Purple Hearts, earned when she had been injured while treating others, always putting her patients before her own safety. "Why are you here?" Admiral Richardson asked gently, gesturing toward the modest diner surroundings. "With your skills and experience, you could be working anywhere. Veterans Affairs, military hospitals, private practice. What brought you to this place?" The question Sarah had been dreading finally came. She looked around the diner at faces that had become familiar over 3 years, people who had known her simply as a reliable waitress with a quick smile and steady hands. Now they were looking at her with a mixture of awe, respect, and curiosity that made her deeply uncomfortable. "Sometimes a person needs to find peace in simple things," she said finally. "This place gave me what I needed." Admiral Richardson nodded with understanding that came from years of watching good soldiers struggle with the transition to civilian life. "The battles don't always end when you come home," he said quietly. "No sir, they don't," Sarah agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. The Admiral studied her face, seeing the signs he had learned to recognize in countless veterans. "Are you getting the help you need? The VA has programs now that didn't exist when you left the service." Sarah's response was interrupted by Bob Stevens, who had quietly approached the counter. The elderly Vietnam veteran extended his hand with obvious respect. "Ma'am, I've been coming here for years, and I never knew. Thank you for your service." What happened next surprised everyone, most of all Sarah herself. One by one, the customers in the diner approached to shake her hand or offer their thanks. Martha Wilson wiped away tears as she hugged the woman who had served her coffee with such quiet dignity. A young mother with 2 small children thanked Sarah for the sacrifices she had made to keep them safe. The local news crew, alerted by someone inside the diner, began setting up their equipment for what they sensed was a much bigger story than they had originally planned to cover. Admiral Richardson noticed the activity and moved to shield Sarah from the cameras, understanding instinctively that she might not want the attention. "We don't have to talk to them," he said quietly. "Your service speaks for itself, and you deserve your privacy." But something had shifted in Sarah during the past few minutes. The recognition she had feared had come, and instead of judgment or pity, she had found respect and gratitude. The walls she had built around her past were crumbling, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. "It's okay," she said, surprising herself with the decision. "Maybe it's time." The interview that followed was brief but powerful. Admiral Richardson spoke about Sarah's heroism while she stood quietly beside him, uncomfortable with the attention but no longer hiding from her past. When asked about her transition to civilian life, she spoke honestly about the challenges facing veterans and the importance of finding purpose after military service. "This diner became my sanctuary," she explained. "The people here gave me a chance to serve in a different way, to be part of a community without judgment. Sometimes healing happens in the most unexpected places." The story spread quickly through social media and news networks. Within hours, Sarah's photograph was being shared across the internet, accompanied by accounts of her battlefield heroism and her quiet post-service life. Veterans organizations reached out, offering support and opportunities. Medical facilities inquired about her availability for positions that would utilize her combat experience. But the most meaningful response came from her fellow diner employees and regular customers. They organized an impromptu celebration that evening, transforming the humble restaurant into something special. Bob Stevens brought in photographs from his own military service, and other veterans shared their stories. The diner became a gathering place for people connected by service, sacrifice, and the understanding that heroism often wears ordinary clothes. Admiral Richardson stayed for the celebration, sharing stories about Sarah's service that helped her co-workers understand the remarkable person they had been working alongside. He spoke about the importance of recognizing veterans and the debt society owed to those who had sacrificed for their country. As the evening wound down, Admiral Richardson approached Sarah one final time. "I have a proposal," he said. "The Navy is developing new combat medic training programs. We need someone with your experience and skills to help train the next generation. Would you consider it?" Sarah looked around the diner that had been her refuge, at the people who had accepted her without knowing her story, and at the opportunity to serve once again in a meaningful way. The fear that had driven her to hide her past was finally beginning to fade, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years: hope for the future. "I'll think about it," she said, and for the first time in 3 years, she truly meant it. The story of the waitress whose secret was revealed by an admiral became a symbol of the hidden heroes living quietly among us. It reminded people that extraordinary courage often wears an ordinary uniform, and that sometimes the most remarkable stories are being written by the person serving your morning coffee or ringing up your groceries. Sarah Martinez continued working at the diner while she considered her options, but something fundamental had changed. She no longer carried her past as a burden to be hidden, but as a source of strength and purpose. The recognition she had feared had become the key to unlocking a future she hadn't dared to imagine. In the end, the small diner on Highway 9 had given her exactly what she needed: a place to heal, a community to belong to, and the time to rediscover who she was beyond the medals and the memories of war.